Hi everyone and welcome back to the Chemist Couple podcast with Lee and Jess. Now this week we're going to be discussing the effects of dietary cholesterol within cardiovascular disease and the risk towards our cardiovascular health. And we just wanted to recap what we discussed last week, and we found, well, we no longer discuss good and bad cholesterol. It's low density lipoprotein cholesterol.
Yeah.
And we all know from studies that low density lipoprotein cholesterol and ApoB100 have an increased risk of developing cardiovascular disease. So we went into looking into, well, does dietary cholesterol also have that positive correlation?
Yeah.
And if we're being honest, looking through the studies, which we've looked independently and we're going to bring our thoughts together now, but the studies are all conflicting in my opinion, and there wasn't any clear yes or no answer.
No. I feel like, as with everything in medicine, the more that you look into something, the more rabbit holes that you can go down and the more evidence that you find. And like you say, the more conflicting evidence that you do come across. So with regards to cholesterol, like we will discuss, there are arguments for, or there's studies that suggest that dietary cholesterol is directly related to cardiovascular disease, whereas there's other studies that suggest that dietary cholesterol has no link to cardiovascular disease.
Yeah, so if you want to bear with us, the main question we are going to answer is, from our opinion, does dietary cholesterol impact your risk of cardiovascular disease?
Yeah.
So let's go into it. Now, one thing I wanted to ask you, before you looked into all the studies and probably even before we went on this health journey, did you think eating more cholesterol in your diet led to an increase in serum cholesterol?
Definitely. And I think that is what we generally tell our patients as well. You know, you see it in general practice that if a patient comes in with high cholesterol, the first thing that we do is tell them to eat less fat in the diet, which is going to potentially impact the cholesterol levels. So yeah, before we did all of this, I definitely thought that there was a huge link between dietary cholesterol and our internal cholesterol would then increasing the risk of cardiovascular disease.
I mean, I was in the same boat in terms of consumption of eggs. I used to eat quite a lot of eggs, trying to build a lot of muscle, and there was this fear that the egg yolk, which does contain cholesterol, on average about 200 milligrams, that would lead to a very high level of cholesterol within the body, increase my risk of cardiovascular disease. So I was always wary of that, and then I went towards egg whites, which a lot of people within, I'm not a bodybuilder, but people who go into bodybuilding do sort of make that transition.
Yeah, because you think you're just getting the protein without the cholesterol.
Yeah.
It is very, very common to see that,
It is. And one of the good things about bringing up eggs is that throughout these studies, eggs were used as basically the gold standard.
Yeah.
So when you actually look at eggs, they have about 200 milligrams of cholesterol within the egg yolk, but also they have a relatively low content of saturated fatty acids in comparison to its whole energy. I think shrimp is actually better because it's got cholesterol again, but no saturated fatty acids from what I've read. But the costs and feasibility make it, well,
because it's more expensive.
Less likely to be studied.
Yeah. I think also we were saying as well the fact that eggs are quite, well, obviously they're the same composition across the world. So it comes from a chicken, it's the same. And then also it's quite, if you say to someone boil an egg, or if you say to someone fry an egg, it's going to be the same sort of outcome because it's consistent across being able to cook it, isn't it? So like it makes it a bit easier to be able to study these things because it's more consistent than, say, asking someone to consume even a shrimp, because some people might eat it raw, some people, you know, in some cultures, some people may boil it, some people may fry it, but it can be it can be different in the way that it's eaten, can't it? So
so I was just thinking we should touch upon guidelines at the moment.
Yeah.
So we are actually going to include US guidelines because from when I've looked at the analytics, there is someone watching in America, whether that's someone we know who's got the VPN put over there, but we are going to try and make it as friendly to people in America as possible. Now in the UK, we advise a low cholesterol diet. There's not so much a value on it, I don't think, in the UK, and we try and limit saturated fatty acid consumption to less than 10% of your calories.
Yeah.
This is also mimicked within the American Dietary Association guidelines, but they removed the need for monitoring your cholesterol intake in your diet. And that was in the 2015 guidelines. They removed it. So they originally had a cap of 300 milligrams per day, which is 1.5 eggs, if you were ever to try and measure that out. But they removed that due to all the evidence that we've looked into in terms of there's no, in their opinion, no direct link between dietary cholesterol and cardiovascular disease risk. So now that we're clear on the guidelines, let's go into the studies. I want you to start in terms of what did you find out from reading? I think we had about 8 studies. What was your general consensus on whether dietary cholesterol impacts serum cholesterol?
Yeah. So there was like we said, we looked at a lot of studies, and so honestly my brain right now is fried, and so I'm going to try and remember some of them, but general consensus was that a lot of them did say that it doesn't matter how much cholesterol you eat, your total cholesterol within the body doesn't affect it. So there was some studies that were suggesting this was because cholesterol is too big of a molecule to be able to be absorbed all of the time. So if we take cholesterol from our diet, for instance, it's a lot of the time it's esterified, which makes it a bigger molecule, which means that there's receptors within our GI tract which the actual cholesterol molecule just doesn't fit in, and so it can't be absorbed, and so it just passes through. Whereas obviously some of them in the diet will be small enough to be able to be passed through into this, into this receptor site. So that was one of the general consensuses. The other one, though, that and a lot of the studies that you do find is that because we are studying humans, it's very difficult to control everything within a population. So whenever you're doing a study, the ideal would be to control it in like the best way possible. So if we were to try and determine cholesterol on a diet, we would basically put a cohort of patients within a room. You'd give them exactly the same food to eat, you'd make them exercise exactly the same. You try and control the stress levels, you try and control like the gut microbiome, all these different external factors. However, in general, when you can confer that, we just wouldn't be able to do that. And so a lot of the studies were saying that, okay, eggs, which was the one that was studied the most, don't affect your cholesterol. However, in one study, it was done in China, the people who were involved in the study, if you eat eggs in China, then you're more likely to come from sort of a higher social status, where you'll be taking part in more physical activity. You're actually generally eating better foods, so the foods are not ultra processed, things like that. So it could have been the eggs that were, it could have been the fact that the cholesterol doesn't have an effect, but also it could have been all of these other things that were affecting the cholesterol levels. So I said to you before we started, I just feel more confused than I did before we went into it.
Yeah, well, before we come on camera, you were sort of conflicted in terms of what should we say during the podcast, what is the answer?
Yeah.
And I said, let's leave it all until we come into this podcast and discuss it all between ourselves. But yeah, I read the China extract saying that they had a lower risk. Again, could that be linked to the lifestyle that these people lead? Japan also had a similar incidence and finding, but then there was a study from Sweden or Switzerland, I can't think, one of the two, where they actually had an increased risk of cardiovascular outcomes and stroke through increased dietary cholesterol. A lot of the studies that you've mentioned are hard to pinpoint, and that's because a lot of them are observational cohort studies, meaning we just examine a group of people over time. We can't impact, there's so many things that could confound the actual results in terms of how's the egg cooked, what is the stress of that person at that time, what is the other pressures, how much are they exercising, how active are they, what other components of their diet have they got. There's so many factors. So when we actually delve into it a bit more, there was some outcomes saying that there was no link in terms of increased cardiovascular disease. There was some that said there were. Yeah. There was also some saying that there was increased heart failure.
Yes, I did see that.
Yeah, and also there was a couple saying that if you had type 2 diabetes or diabetes to any description, then that would increase your cardiovascular outcomes. So basically, when we went through all these studies, there was actually, the answer that I come to was, there's no categoric answer that I could definitely say to someone, if you eat X amount of cholesterol within your diet, don't worry because we only absorb a small amount.
Yeah, because I think even that, if you've listened to the podcast before this one, we've always said, only 10 to 20% of the cholesterol from our diet is absorbed, but then when we've looked at other studies, it says that it could be up to 60%. So it's so difficult to sort of come to a conclusion on what is the recommended amount of cholesterol that you should eat. Like, can you just eat an unlimited amount and it won't affect your total cholesterol or any like LDL cholesterol in your blood? I just feel so confused.
Yeah. So the process of what happens when you absorb or when you eat dietary cholesterol, we looked into the transporters. So the idea is there's the Niemann Pixie 1 like 1 I think transporter, which basically takes in cholesterol that can be taken in if it's not too big of a molecule. And then there's another one called ABCG5G8, which basically looks back into the body and says, what's the level of cholesterol? If we've got too much, then we can output it. There's then the theory that when you actually do absorb dietary cholesterol, it then feeds back to the liver to say we actually don't need any more cholesterol production. So then it down-regulates an enzyme called HMG-CoA reductase. So then that is the rate-limiting step within cholesterol synthesis, and that reduces internal cholesterol. My point is, if only 10 to 20% is absorbed, how can that have such a big impact on the general mechanics of cholesterol production? And in my opinion, from what I've read, it's mainly down to your genetic predisposition. And we've also discussed what is the benefit of having low-density lipoprotein cholesterol and ApoB100, because from what I've read, we are, I think us, maybe guinea pigs, exhibit this level of transport, because apparently HDL, high-density lipoproteins can do reverse cholesterol transport and actually deposit it within the cells that need it. So you always look back at an evolutionary point of view and say, well, there must have been something. You always look back to look forward. And I think that's right with medicine. We need to know, why is the body adapted in such a way to go forward. And you had a theory, did you?
I didn't, but I did look at some study. Well, it was a National Geographic study that was done, and it wasn't so much a study, but they were just looking at cohorts of people and the way that we utilise different foods. And I think this also comes back to maybe what Zoe are doing in terms of everybody's different in the way that we utilise food within the body, and it goes back to our genes. So if we think about, we always think about our ancestors being meat eaters, and that was all they ate, and they were like carnivores. And actually in certain cohorts of people, so if you look at the Finnish, I think a lot of them were actually just solely eating meat because that was all that they could get. Obviously, if you're thinking about, it's a desert, isn't it? Like, that's very cold. So there is no vegetation to be able to eat. So they were just, so then their bodies and their genes have adapted to be able to to use that as fuel and use it to the best of its ability. So they, if you think about meat does contain a lot of cholesterol. So maybe people who have the genes of the Finnish may be able to deal with cholesterol in a better way than someone who was on a typical diet from our ancestors, which was usually foraged berries and fruits, whole grains, like things like sweet potatoes and stuff like that, rather than it just being meat. I think they were looking and saying that about 30% of like our ancestors' diets were consisted of meat. It wasn't just pure meat like we always like we're led to believe. And so everybody's genes are different, and the way that we are able to use food is different. And I think that it does have a big impact.
Well, it does. I mean, if you look at lactose, for example, we did develop the enzyme mainly in Scandinavia because of the use of cows and consumption of milk, whereas that wasn't as prevalent within Asia. So that's why a lot of people do have lactose intolerance. But when you just touched upon meat being a big thing, and I think we should go over what foods are high in cholesterol, dietary cholesterol. So I think looking at the top 5 foods consumed within America that relates to cholesterol, you had eggs, you had beef, pork, poultry, and butter, and there was, there's that 5? I don't even. I lost count. But butter, and then cheeses. So even if it's more than 5, I'll put them out there now. But what a lot of these foods do have at the same time is a high composition of saturated fatty acids. So this is where this belief from the people who produce the guidelines and high up within medical boards have come to the conclusion that it's actually not cholesterol, because when they've studied eggs, they can't categorically say that it increases it, and the proportion of cholesterol to saturated fatty acids are low. So they've come up with the idea that we should actually focus upon saturated fatty acids as opposed to cholesterol. But when we've looked in other studies where they limit the consumption of saturated fatty acids, it's normally substituted by monounsaturated and polyunsaturated fatty acids, those that are classed as essential. And is it more of a case of we're reducing the bad guys within our diet, or are we increasing the good guys? Again, we're going to do a podcast. So we've just had our bloods done on Thursday. Hopefully they come back within 5 to 10 days. The idea is that we do a podcast on our results to see what has happened, and we'll be transparent on how we've led our life to get the results we've got. We will then say what we will do going forward and use the evidence to lower certain aspects that may be classed as high risk to our health.
Yeah.
But going back to the saturated fatty acids, we've tried to reduce that ourselves, haven't we, going forward?
Well, yeah. I mean, if we do look back on our diet,
true.
Yeah, I mean, we did have a lot less saturated fatty acids. So if anyone's been listening to the podcast since the beginning, you'll know that one of the reasons why we started it was because Lee went through a bout of ill health and you ended up getting your bloods done. Now, you've got a strong family history of cardiovascular disease, which we will discuss in the results podcast. But so anyway, you got your bloods tested and your cholesterol, your LDL cholesterol in particular, was really high, higher than what we would have ever thought, because your diet was very low in saturated fat. So just for context,
it was 146 milligrams per deciliter for Americans, and about, I think it's 3.76 in the UK. And
in our diet at that point, the only saturated fat that you were having was from dairy, in the context of milk, which you didn't really have that much milk. Like,
I was probably having a pint and a half a day. About a pint a day with a protein shake at that point.
When we were cooking with like them oil sprays, where it was like, they're really not good for you. We would definitely not advocate for them, but they were low calorie sprays, so that they have very minimal saturated fat in. And then apart from that, we didn't eat cheese. You didn't eat junk food, in terms of like, we don't eat takeaways. So at that time, the saturated fat in your diet was very low. And
yeah,
then
we actually measured it for a day. I think it came out at 19 grams, I think.
And isn't it?
Well, they recommend less than 30, I think, off the top of my head, for an average UK male.
It was way less than what it should have been, and yet your cholesterol was really high. Then we obviously switched the diet up, and now we have half an avocado every single day. We cook only with extra virgin olive oil. Olive oil goes into almost every single dressing that I make. We still do have chicken almost every day. We eat eggs almost every single day, which we are probably going to change our diet a little bit. But what else? We have nuts and seeds on every breakfast. I sometimes even will put it in dinners, things like that. And so we are having a lot more fat in our diet.
So we've increased the fat, we've increased technically the cholesterol, I'd say the cholesterol's maintained a similar level.
Yeah.
But we have increased our mono and polyunsaturated fats, and that did lead to a reduction in my blood results. Exercise was pretty constant throughout. Again, these are individuals, so like we always say, because something's happened to one person doesn't mean it's going to happen to a population. And that's where a lot of these studies actually come about in terms of cholesterol transport, because they found that there was a subset of people who had a genetic abnormality within this particular gene for PCSK9, which affects liver receptor expression, etc. And these people could eat basically whatever they wanted, and they didn't really have an increased risk of cardiovascular disease, because their circulating cholesterol within low density lipoproteins was virtually non-existent, which has led to pharmacotherapy advancing down that route. And when we looked into results the other day, we will touch upon this in the results one, but the studies are suggesting that we still aim a lot higher.
Too high than
what it is. And I still can't get my head around the fact that we actively allow this to happen.
Well, the fact that it's the number one biggest killer of people across the world, heart disease, and
still 15-16% of worldwide deaths are attributed to.
It's baffling, but we'll discuss this in the results one, because I think the biggest thing that I've taken out of this is that I'm honestly very unsure about dietary cholesterol, but I do think that the types of foods that we do eat can impact our cholesterol. I did look at a study to do with the gut microbiome, something that I'm really interested in actually. Obviously, it's in the very beginning of being able to understand it, and more and more studies will come about this in the next 10 years, I think. But it was saying that it was done on rats, so obviously that's not the best. But they basically depleted rats of their gut microbiome by giving them antibiotics for a prolonged period of time, and then they fed them and then basically tested the cholesterol of these rats, and actually it was like quite invasive. Like when I was reading it, they were like extracting liver cells and things like that, so it was really like an in-depth study. And basically the conclusion was that rats that had the gut microbiome taken out were not able to the cholesterol levels were higher, and they think it was because the gut microbiome plays an important role in actually regulating the absorption of cholesterol from our diet, but also the actual metabolism of cholesterol within the liver. So,
it's interesting. I mean, we are very knowledgeable in terms of how we use cholesterol within the body.
Yeah.
We have got a better understanding.
Yeah.
But in terms of the microbiome, we don't know too much.
Yeah.
Do you think it's more important that we look at the microbiome as opposed to look at liver physiology around a lot of conditions?
I think that...
Or not as important? Do you think it's still very influential?
Yeah, I do. Obviously, you know, genes play a huge role in the way that we will, for cholesterol anyway, that we will metabolize it. And we know that, like you've just said, from the people who've got like the PCSK9, what's it called?
The PCSK9 genetic.
Genetic variations. Also, like people who have got familial hypercholesterolemia, who've got, you know, the LDL receptors on the liver aren't working correctly, things like that. So we do know that genetics play a huge role in the pathophysiology of CVD risk, but also I think the gut microbiome, as it does play an important role, and I think it plays an important role in everything in our body. We were saying, weren't we, that, you know, there's bacteria, viruses, protozoa, fungi, all of these different things living on our skin, within our gut, and they are a lot older than we are. You know, they were the first forms of life, and so they're a lot more advanced, or they were able to adapt a lot more than what we can.
Yeah, we're poor.
Yeah, we are. And so I think we've got a lot to learn from them, because, like, say for instance, I was watching a program about fungi the other day, and fungi have already been able to basically digest plastics. So plastics have not been around for that long, and there's already fungi that have been able to utilize that and use it for food. So it's crazy, like, how much they can adapt. And I think there is a lot that we can learn. And I think obviously even in terms of, like, you know, our ancestors and our genes, and going back thousands of years, they've always been with us, you know, since the very first formation of like humans. So we've got a lot to learn from them, I think.
Yeah, I mean, we can look back in medicine and science and history in terms of what we should be doing, but like you said, we always evolve. So is there going to come a point where we will adapt to this higher saturated fat, higher cholesterol, higher ultra-processed food diet?
Yeah.
Or is it now, because modern medicine keeps a lot of people alive that wouldn't have been alive, let's say 2 centuries ago, that this survival of the fittest isn't really passing on the desirable genes to the next generation?
Yeah, which is probably true, to be honest.
I think that's more true.
I think we were saying, weren't we, that we're the destruction of our own self, like the humans, aren't we? So like by sort of improving ourselves, we're also it's detrimental to everything. So not even just in the context of medicine, but in the context of technology and things. We sort of don't think about looking into the future too much. We just sort of do whatever's best for us, in that moment, rather than looking ahead. But
okay, well, going back to the question then. No, I always feel like I say this, but I did say before we done the podcast, I will try and keep a mark in my head. But in terms of dietary cholesterol and cardiovascular disease, we have looked at a lot of egg studies, and the general consensus is they don't really increase your risk of cardiovascular disease. However, the caveat is there's not many randomized controlled trials, and it's mainly prospective cohort studies. So take from that what you will. We've put the studies below, and we always do. You can look at them. If you really want to make your brain hurt before you go to sleep, look at them. What would you say, looking at the guidelines as well, the footnotes at the very bottom, they go on to advise the American Dietary Association on what they should do. They say we no longer put the 300 milligrams a day of dietary cholesterol as a target that you should go below, because a lot of the average Americans anyway eat about 219 milligrams. So this is again why they think it doesn't impact certain
because we're not eating enough anyway.
Yeah, because we don't eat enough, and certain studies didn't correlate, because they only showed positive correlation once it got into the
about the thousands, wasn't it?
Thousands of milligrams. So they thought, well, this is not directly proportional to normal living. They have advised that we should minimize saturated fatty acid consumption to less than 10%. The Heart Association in America say less than 7%. And we should be mindful to increase, basically they're saying adapt your diet to a whole food diet, include more fibre, and try and focus on that as opposed to focusing on what you're eating in cholesterol.
Yeah.
So I think what Dave said in as many words is, if you increase these components of your diet, it will mitigate the risk of what these are going to do.
Yeah.
And that's what I take from it.
I probably would agree. Yeah, I agree with that. I think we always advocate for the same thing on all of these, is that a Mediterranean diet is what we usually do suggest. Like I say at the beginning, sometimes we will also suggest if a patient comes in with dyslipidemia to do a diet low in cholesterol or saturated fat. But like you say, I think if you eat a whole food diet that is rich in whole grains, that's rich in fruits, that's rich in vegetables, I think automatically it does reduce your amount of saturated fat, it automatically does reduce the amount of cholesterol. And then like you say, you're also getting all that fibre that's going to be feeding your gut microbiome. And so I think that all of those things combined will mitigate the risks that it would be instead of just eating like foods in isolation.
Yeah, and at the moment, like we said, there's no cap on cholesterol, but I wouldn't advocate anyone going out there to consume unholy amounts of eggs or other cholesterol-rich foods, because like we've just shown from the 90s, well, late 60s until the late 90s, it was capped cholesterol. Now it's sort of, let's leave it be. So science and medicine always evolves and changes, but for the time being, increase your fibre content, activity, general well-being, I would say. We're going to be transparent with our results coming up. We always are. And our aim is, we want to do a podcast separately to state this, but our aim is to try and find the best balance of having a healthy lifestyle and include all areas within your lifestyle. So diet, exercise, sleep, stress management, and everything has a trade-off. So if I need to go on treatment for something, is the side effect profile better? There's so many things that we can talk about. Yeah.
And then I think the last thing that I just want to say with regards to this podcast is just to be more mindful of your blood cholesterol, because like we said last time, I've never had my cholesterol checked and I'm now 30. And as we know, atherosclerosis is building up in your arteries from your 20s potentially. So obviously now I'm grateful that I've had the opportunity to go and get my cholesterol checked, also my ApoB, which, the NHS don't offer, but this charity has done. And so I think if you have the opportunity to go and do it, then definitely get it checked. And then also look into the levels that it really should be, because like you were saying before, we do tend to run it a bit higher for some reason, which we will go into into the results podcast. But just be mindful of it. And then as always, try and incorporate more and more fruit, vegetables, whole grains, nuts, seeds, avocados, olive oil, all of the good stuff that's going to feed your gut microbiome. And and keep up with your exercise.
I hope our results show some good.
I know.
If not, we're not going to post them. We're just going to change them all and make them, fraud them before we put them on. But as always, actually, the next podcast, we are going to try and discuss calories.
Yeah.
We're going to touch upon calories because it gives us time to get our results back and analyse them and look into the studies behind that. Next one is going to be about calories and our opinion on whether you should count them or not, and the evidence that we've looked at. Then we'll go into our results, and then after that one, we will be looking at ways to hopefully minimise your cholesterol and what we're going to do over the next 3 months until we get another blood test.
Yeah.
One thing I didn't say at the beginning, is that these are our opinions of the evidence, and it shouldn't be used in substitute to seeing a medical professional. But from me, thanks for listening this week.
Yeah, thank you for listening.